Hi, so my name is Alyssa Berger, and in this video I'm going to be going over different qualities of parchment ranging from the 12th century to about the 15th century. In this video you'll see how much the quality of parchment can vary, and in some cases parchment was so fine that it is almost indistinguishable from paper. Now let's go take a look. So here we have the Brut Chronicle, an illuminated manuscript written in about 1430. Which gives a history of England starting with the hero Brutus's conquest of Albion. The parchment is very dark, partly due to age, but we also know that it is not the finest quality parchment because on some sheets you can very clearly see the hair follicles in the parchment. Remember, this is skin of an animal, so all of this, those are the hair follicles. It's still a pretty nice manuscript and nicely illuminated, but as we will see with more manuscripts, finer parchment sheets will be a lot finer and you're not going to be able to see all of those hair follicles. So here we have the Vulgate Bible, which came from southern France and was made around the years 1230 to 1250. Immediately compared to the Brut Chronicle, we can see that the parchment is of a lot finer material. Obviously, I'm the one feeling this, and you can't, but it feels pretty much like paper. It is so thin, and it's so white. This is clearly a very fine Bible, probably for a noblewoman. And, yeah, I can't find any hair follicles whatsoever as I flip through. So, whereas with the Brut Chronicle it was very obvious where they were, here the parchment is so fine that to my modern eye it's almost indistinguishable from paper. If I didn't know this was parchment, I would have no idea. And in fact, when I examined this with some of my classmates, we immediately thought it was paper just because it's so thin, if you can see that, and finely made. And it's really hard today to even make parchment of this quality because in between the Brut Chronicle and just this Vulgate Bible, you can see that parchment varies greatly in terms of quality. So we just looked at the Vulgate Bible, and now we're going to examine an even finer work called the Book of Hours, which was created around the same time and France around 1430, but just looking at the casing that it's in, you can see we're going to be examining some pretty fine parchment. Just a really beautiful, even though this was probably added later. So, similarly with this parchment, it is pretty paper-like. It's actually quite a bit thicker. It almost feels like velvet if you run your finger across it. A lot of illuminations here that are very beautiful to see. And so also this kind of shows you a bit of the capabilities that are possible with parchment, because if you've ever written on papyrus, as we had the opportunity to do so in this class, it's very difficult to write on. And so when you get parchment, not only is it easier to write on, but it's almost like it just expands the capabilities of the scribe, because now you can do all these illuminations that on papyrus would have been completely impossible. So we can see really here how greatly parchment expanded the work of the scribes and the monks. Another thing that's really interesting to note is that this is a very expensive piece. My professor compared these books to something like buying a Ferrari today, or just a car that costs more than $100,000. So valuable is not only this parchment, but also this work. And so to the modern audience, this might be a bit incomprehensible, but in medieval times and in ancient times, remember, this is all coming from animals, which are much more expensive to raise than they are today. And then you have to create parchment out of them, and an animal actually really does not give that much parchment. So, these take many animals to make, and then on top of that, they take all the time and work of the monks who are illuminating these manuscripts. We've just looked at some really fine codexes and really fine examples of parchment. So now we're also going to look at one that, kind of like the Brut Chronicle, is not as fine. So this is from 12th century Britain, and this would have been for more everyday use by monks. So again, the parchment's very thick. It's very leathery too, as with the Brut Chronicle. So while with the the manuscripts that we just looked at, the parchment was so fine it was indistinguishable from paper, this here is very clearly an animal. Again, you can see all of the hair follicles, and it smells kind of like, obviously, like something like this page, which is cracked and wrinkled, just is not anything close to paper. You can also see some mends in the parchment. As you can see here, the text goes around the mend, which is sewn up, a little tear in the parchment, which means that this mend in the parchment was made before the scribe wrote this text. And so what this tells us is this was probably, as again, you can see all these hair follicles. So while, of course, this is still incredibly expensive due to its nature of coming from an animal, it had probably been stretched too far and then had to be mended. And it's the fact that, it's included in this book means that this is not the highest quality. This is probably more everyday use. And in fact, it is a book of Psalms that was probably used by the monks in a monastery. But this is really interesting to see the way that they mended tears when they occurred. For an everyday use, this whole sheet of parchment is very expensive, and you wouldn't want to just abandon all of that. Another interesting thing to see is what happened when they made a mistake. So here, I can feel it, they've scratched out the parchment in order to erase a mistake. So that's something that's pretty interesting that could be done if an error was made with parchment. Sometimes, of course, they just would scratch it out with a line of a pen, but they also would actually scratch the actual parchment. This is another fine work that we'll look at for its parchment. It's called Le Roman de l'Heureuse, and it comes from Paris in the early 14th century. So here again you can see lots of gold used in the small illuminated manuscripts. The parchment's very nice. You can't really see, if I get close, you can't really see any hair follicles, though just from being able to touch it, it doesn't feel quite as fine as the Book of Hours or the Vulgate Bible that we looked at earlier. But again, you can see the high quality of this parchment compared to the Brut Chronicle and the Book of Psalms that we just looked at. For our last example, this is just one leaf of parchment that came from a Bible around the end of the 12th century from France. It's actually quite a fine Bible, as you can see if I zoom out a bit, that there's really, really wide margins. And so this would have been incredibly expensive to just use this small amount of the parchment. And this is also an incredibly fine example of parchment that feels so smooth, like paper, and just again really illustrates the capabilities of parchment. It's distinguishable from paper, but it's almost finer, I would say, and it's very clearly a luxury item. So this is actually a codex that someone in my class made, and we actually used paper for most of it, but several of the pages were indeed parchment, and of course this is parchment that has been made recently, so it's very, very thick. It feels very stiff. It's also quite obvious, here I'll get a little closer, which is the hair side and which is the skin side, because you can kind of feel very clearly and see the hair follicles. This person has some smears in the writing, and I found that I had this similar problem just because it was pretty difficult writing on this parchment. It was not very conducive to writing, unlike the finer parchment that was made in medieval times. So this is just kind of a good example of how difficult it is really to make parchment. Even in modern times, we can't quite get back to what they were capable of in medieval times. So I hope that this has helped you really understand the value of parchment, which at times was very expensive and very fine, and which we no longer produce in that same quality today.